Hello, my students. It's Mrs. Vonderhaar again, and we are ready to start a new unit. So we are building on the skills that we have been learning, working through Bridge to Terabithia and our 6 Minutes podcast, and we're going to start tackling our very own storytelling. And that's the name of this unit. This is Language Arts 6, as you well know, and it is week 13. The learning targets for this lesson. I can use sensory language to describe a setting and character. I can identify sensory language when used in a written text. Now, these are the two learning targets for this specific lesson, but this is something we're going to be continuing with throughout this entire unit. So let's start with a really fantastic question. Why do we tell stories? Well, the reason why is because those who tell stories rule the world. That's a Native American proverb. And that's a really big claim to make, right? That those who tell stories are the ones who rule the world. But let's take a closer look at that claim. With a well-told story, we can help a person see things in an entirely new way. We can forge new relationships and strengthen the ones we already have. We can change a law, inspire a movement, make people care fiercely about things they'd never given a passing thought. That quote is from Jennifer Gonzalez, and she writes a lot about the art of writing and the power of writing. And I want you guys to think about a time when you heard a story that had an effect on you in a way that you didn't expect. Maybe it was someone telling you a story. Maybe it was reading a short story or a book. Maybe it's a movie you watched. And it caused you to have a feeling inside your heart that you didn't expect, or perhaps it made you think about the topic in a completely new way. That is the importance of storytelling. So, how do we tell stories? Is there a formula? Are there rules? How do we do it? You already tell stories all the time. So, whenever you tell a friend what you did over the weekend, maybe when I ask you during a class connect how you're doing, how your day is going, and you update me on everything, maybe when you write a text over phone or messenger about what happened while you were playing your video game. Any of those are stories. Think about a story that you told this week. Who did you tell it to? Why did you tell it? And do you think that your story had the impact that you wanted it to? There are 5 elements of a good story. The first one we're going to talk about is characterization. Now you'll notice that there is a little asterisk, or otherwise known as a little star, after characterization, and it's also after plot and setting. That's because we have covered those before in our class. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to cover them again, but this may be more of a review for you when we do go over them in future weeks. Okay, so characterization is the way in which an author shows the personality of a character. It makes the characters come to life. All right, now the next one listed on here is voice, which is a writer's style or the speech and thought patterns of characters in a story. Now, voice is new to us in this class, and we will be going over it more next week. The one I want us to focus on is the one that is highlighted in yellow, and it is sensory language, which is a writing style that focuses on the 5 senses: touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. Okay, that's what we're going to focus on today. But just so we can go through all of them, I'm also going to go through plot, which is the main events of a story. And if you remember, the main events of a story are exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. And then we have setting, which also has a star behind it because, again, we've gone through it before. The place or type of surroundings where a story takes place. Now that we've gone through these 5 elements of a good story, I want you to think about a book that you've read recently and one that you really enjoyed. So it can be one or the other. So it could be one that you read recently, or it could be one that you have read in the past that you really liked. You can even use Bridge to Terabithia, since I know we all finished that recently. Now, tell me how that author used at least one of these elements in the story you read. All right, so when we're talking about sensory language, we're talking about a technique used by writers to help the reader see or relate to an image or description by connecting it to the five senses. Now, that's a really long sentence, so let's break it down. So, a technique is a method that they use. It is a thing that they do when they're writing that is to help the reader, you and me, to see in our mind or relate to an image. So if we don't see it in our mind, we at least put that association in our brain to the image, because then it helps us to see the image or the description better in our head. I know that sounds a little confusing, but I promise it will make sense over the next couple of slides here. Now, as a reminder, the five senses are smell, taste, hearing, touch, and sight. So the reason why we use the five senses when writing is because a good setting helps the reader to visualize the places in the story. All right, so when you have a good setting, when it is described well, the reader can visualize the place and places, depending upon whether or not you have more than one place, in the story. And a good author includes descriptions of the setting and characters using the five senses. And another reason why we do this is so that we can get into the mind of the character and we can feel more connected to the character. Because if you think about stories that you have read in the past, when you connect with a character or maybe something that's happening to the character, then you feel more invested in the story. You want to keep reading, and that is always what you want. You want your reader to want to keep reading. They want you to keep telling the story. So here are a list of adjective examples, okay? Adjectives, generally speaking, we use sensory language in conjunction with adjectives or as adjectives in our stories. Adjectives are describing words. Now, this is a very brief list here. There are an infinite number of adjectives in our language, but I want you guys to get an idea of what adjectives are, even though you probably know what they are now that you see them, but we're going to be using the term adjective and sensory language a lot, and I want to make sure that you guys know what I am talking about. So how sensory language draws a picture in the reader's mind. Now, my students who are in my communications class will recognize, one, the five sentences and how to write sensory language, because we've been working on it in that class as well. It's the same concept, except that we are using this in order to tell a fictional, meaning a made-up story, okay? So let's use something that I know we are familiar with. This is an excerpt, which means a section of Bridge to Terabithia. And let's go through and see how Katherine Paterson used sensory language to draw a picture in our minds, because we are the reader, about Jess's perfect day. Entering the gallery was like stepping inside the pine grove. The huge vaulted marble, the cool splash of the fountain, and the green growing all around. Two little children had pulled away from their mothers and were running about, screaming to each other. It was all Jess could do not to grab them and tell them how to behave in so obviously a sacred place. And then the pictures, room after room, floor after floor. He was drunk with color and form and hugeness, and with the voice and perfume of Miss Edmonds always beside him, she would bend her head down close to his face to give some explanation or ask him a question, her black hair falling across her shoulders. Men would stare at her instead of the pictures, and Jess felt they must be jealous of him for being with her. Okay, so we have a lot to unpack here when it comes to sensory language. And I would like to highlight as we go along here. I'm getting all of my tools set up, so thank you for your patience. And here we go. So entering the gallery was like stepping inside the pine grove. the huge vaulted marble. These are all adjectives. These are all describing words. The cool splash of the fountain, the green growing all around. Two little children, we know they're young, had pulled away from their mothers and were running about, screaming to each other. Now we know that they're running about and they're screaming. So we can imagine that they're loud. Because Catherine Patterson could have just said that there were other kids there, but instead she told us that they were running around and they were screaming, and that it affected Jess in that he realized that he felt like this was a sacred place. That tells us a lot about Jess, and it tells us a lot about the situation. And then the pictures, room after room, floor after floor. So she could have said there were a lot of pictures on the walls, but instead she tells us that they were everywhere. She's using repetition here to show that they were everywhere, and there were so many of them. He was drunk with color and form and hugeness. So saying that he was drunk meant that his mind was completely filled to the brim with color and form and hugeness, and with the voice and perfume of Miss Edmonds always beside him. She would bend her head down close to his face and give some explanation or ask him a question, her black hair falling across her shoulder. Men would stare at her and said the pictures, and Jill felt that they must be jealous of him for being with her. All right. So now that we've highlighted our words, we can go back here and we can discuss a little bit more. So huge vaulted marble. All right, so that's definitely sight, right? He's seeing the huge vaulted marble, the cool splash of the fountain. So the splash is going to be hearing, and it's cool, so that's touch. Now we see little children running about, that's sight, but they're screaming to each other, so that's hearing. And then to behave, and so obviously a sacred place. Now this is something he's seeing, but it's also something he's feeling inside of himself, so that really taps into emotions too. So then let's jump down here to the color and form and hugeness. All right, that's all based upon sight. The voice, hearing, and perfume, that's smelling. And he talks about her black hair, and that's sight. And then again, we're coming down to emotions with jealous, but he's seeing the men, so it's all based upon sight. Okay, so you can see that even in this very short piece of writing from Catherine Patterson, we're able to see how much she uses sensory language in order to draw the picture in our mind of Jess going to this art museum and what he's feeling and what he is seeing. It's much more than Jess went to a museum, period. There were people there, period. There were a lot of pictures, period. Right? It's much more than that. So I wanted to show you guys an example, okay, of using the five senses with adjectives. So this is a picture I found online from a website that offers free images done by artists. This is a photograph. And this is the description, the very basic description to describe it. The man worked at a table. That's very obvious. We have a man sitting here and he's working at a table. But what if we start thinking more? What if we try to form this into a story? And this is what I came up with. The elderly metalsmith, Mr. Sue, sat hunched over his cluttered workbench, his eyes bleary from the day's work. His weathered hands ached, as they always did on dark, damp days. But tonight he knew something vitally important was going to happen. His nose caught a brief whiff of the salty sea in the chilly, unwelcoming air around him, and he knew something was about to occur to finally upset his daily drudgery of making copper teapots, which he had done for the last half-century. Now, I know nothing about this person. This is something I made up. But how did I do this? Okay, how did I come up with this? Now, you can see that I used a lot of descriptive language. I used a lot of adjectives: dark, damp, elderly, and he's hunched over. His eyes are bleary from the day's work. His workbench is cluttered. Okay? And it goes on and on from there. Now, how did I do this? Well, let's walk through it. Once I had the image, I asked, who is my character? I always like to give my characters names. You don't have to. A lot of authors choose not to, and that's another technique that they use, but I like to give them names. Where is he? Well, we see that he's obviously working, and it looks like he's working at his workbench because he has all of these teapots around him. But maybe that's not what he's doing. What do you think he's doing? Why is he here? Well, maybe he's working. Maybe he's thinking. Maybe he's coming up with a new plan. I decided he was working here and that it was nearing the end of his workday. What is he thinking? Okay, and so I went into how he was thinking about the daily drudgery, how his work has gotten long and hard and he's getting older and that something new is going to happen. Why do we care? Well, that's our job as writers, is to tell people why we care. We need to tell them why we care about what's going on in the story, and we do that using descriptive language and by telling a vital story that we think is interesting. Okay? Here we go. Let's keep going, you guys. Now, I know that was a kind of brief introduction to it, but we've been doing quite a bit of work on analyzing plot and structure of a story, and I think you guys are ready to try writing a detailed description of the picture that I have posted here. And what is happening in the picture? Imagining that you are on the edge of the bridge. So pretend that you're on the edge of the bridge. What's going to happen? What is happening in this picture? Why are you there? Who are you? Okay, include as many adjectives as you can. Don't forget to include descriptions for each of the 5 senses. Sight, hearing, touch. Taste, I put as optional because taste can be really hard to describe. And smell. Taste sometimes doesn't work into a narrative, but often I like to include taste if there's something in the air. Sometimes maybe there's smoke in the air and it's so dense that you can taste it. Or maybe you're eating something and you can describe the taste of it and how it's associated with what's going on around you. Okay, so this is our very first try at really doing a creative piece, and I'm really excited to see what you guys come up with.